May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Please be seated. So today we celebrate the Feast of the Transfiguration, when we remember that Peter, James, and John and Jesus went up to the top of Mount Tabor when they climbed up that mountain with Jesus. Mount Tabor is up in the Galilee, the northern part of the current state of Israel. It's a dome-shaped mountain that rises up out of the lowlands like a half sphere, a kind of a hump in the land like you find on the back of a giant camel. Geologists call it a monadnock. It's the highest point in the region, and on a clear day they might have even been able to see the Sea of Galilee out in the distance. It's easy to wonder what Jesus might have planned that day. Why did they go up there on the mountain? We don't know why they made that climb. Maybe they did it to get up high and to see over the Jezreel Valley. Maybe they were remembering where they had been, trying to see Nazareth maybe, where Jesus grew up. Or maybe they were trying to see their path through the Arbel Pass to Magdala, which would have been the route that Jesus went from Nazareth down to the Sea of Galilee when he was teaching in Capernaum. Maybe they were pointing out Cana up in the hills where Jesus did his first miracle. You remember when Mary and Jesus went to a wedding in Cana and the host ran out of wine and Jesus just made more. You know what it's like when you get to a high place, right? You want to look down and you want to see what you might recognize and what it might look like from that vantage point. Like, I don't know, a big building in a city, maybe a bell tower, ours, maybe the crest of the Pell Bridge. You want to look down and see things you know. Your neighborhood, your old house, your school. The ordinary, mundane things that make up our lives' experience. You want to know what they look like from up there. Or maybe Peter, James, and John were trying to look out to get a clear view of where they were going next, where they were going and what might happen. At this point in Matthew's gospel, remember, Jesus has already told the disciples once that he will be crucified and die, and 3 days later he will rise from the dead. He'll tell them 2 more times before the gospel concludes, and they still won't believe him until it happens. These days, pilgrims climb Mount Tabor, also known as the Mount of Transfiguration, in 2 or 3 18-person vans. And it's a windy road of really hairpin switchbacks up the side. You go back and forth as you climb the mountain, traversing, going higher and higher. And I've had the experience many times during the outside run, because no matter where you sit on the van, you're always going to be on the outside for one of the switchbacks. That if I just took a breath or leaned too hard, the whole van would just tumble off the side of the mountain. Those vans are driven by a Palestinian family who own the restaurant and the shop at the bottom of the Camel's Hump Mountain, and it's a steep climb. Some people make it a religious commitment to climb the mountain on foot. And some people, there's one guy I saw over and over again last year who made it his fitness commitment. It was his exercise to ride his bicycle up and down twice a day. There's a beautiful park at the top where people go for picnics, so look out. And on a clear day, you can see for miles. But as it turned out, whatever the reason Peter, James, and John went up there that day, They didn't end up looking out at the valley below them. At least that's not what was remembered and what was written about. Instead, they looked up. They looked up at the story of their relationship with God from all history until that moment, and up into their eternal future. Suddenly they saw Jesus, his face shining like the sun, and his clothes a dazzling white, glowing in the company of Moses and Elijah, talking with them. Then a bright cloud surrounded the top of the mountain, and God spoke to them, saying, "This is my Son, my beloved. With him I am well pleased." So, Peter's response is immediate, right? "Whoa, Jesus, we'll stay up here on the mountain with you. We'll build a house here, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." This is another example of Peter's overabundant enthusiasm. But there's also a really deep background here. Remember our Old Testament reading this morning, with Moses up on Mount Sinai in God's cloud of glory for the full 40 days and nights, receiving the law. The cloud of glory on Mount Sinai was so memorable that it comes up also in the psalm. Moses and Aaron among his priests, he spoke to them out of the pillar of cloud. They kept his testimonies and the decree that he gave them, proclaimed the greatness of the Lord our God, and worshiped him upon his holy hill. Does God's bright cloud up on the Mount of Transfiguration that spoke out love for Jesus trigger the disciples' cultural memory and scriptural memory of God's cloud of glory on Mount Sinai? And is there anything in the story of God's cloud of glory on Mount Sinai that could explain Peter's sudden impulse to build some holy housing? We didn't read this part this morning, but in the very next chapter, after our Old Testament reading today, which is in Exodus 24, is chapter 25, and that is where God tells Moses from the cloud of glory on Mount Sinai to have the people build him a house. "Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you," God says. We're supposed to be thinking about Moses and God's cloud of glory on Mount Sinai and the 10 Commandments when we hear about Jesus' transfiguration. As preacher John Vest writes, on Mount Sinai, God's word is given to the people in the form of the law. In the Transfiguration, Christ is revealed as the embodiment of God's word. Peter, in offering to build a holy housing complex for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, is doing exactly what God asked of Moses and the people in Exodus, which means Peter was grounded in the Hebrew Bible and knew exactly what to do when a cloud of glory shows up. And I get Peter's impulse. What a shining moment that must have been. Today's epistle is almost a breathless description of the disciples' excitement. But we had been eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received honor and glory from God the Father when that voice was conveyed to him by the majestic glory, that's the cloud, saying, "This is my Son, my beloved, with whom I am well pleased." We ourselves heard this voice come from heaven while we were with him on the holy mountain. So Peter's excitement is understandable. He's just seen Jesus, the same Jesus who walked beside him up the mountain, his face shining like the sun, with his clothes a dazzling white, deep in conversation with Moses and Elijah. Of course he wanted to memorialize it. Of course he wanted to build a house and stay there forever, to make that moment last. But instead, Jesus gathers up the disciples and says it's time to go back down the mountain and get back to work. Preacher Elizabeth Palmer writes, "What a strange kind of glory this is. A divine power that refuses to hover above the earth in glorified form, but instead climbs back down the mountain and walks straight toward crucifixion, one dusty foot in front of the other." What does this mean for us today? To me, it means that there is potential in the most ordinary places for transformation. It means that grace comes to us in mundane form, like bread, wine, water, a narrow road of switchbacks, and pairs of dusty feet. The promise of Transfiguration is that the glory of God transforms our world and us from the inside out. Today is the last Sunday of Epiphany, our season of Epiphany before Lent. And the season where we remember, Lent is the season where we remember Jesus' 40 days and nights in the wilderness, getting ready, preparing for his earthly ministry. And today is also that day when we remember the Transfiguration and Jesus, James, John, and Peter's experience up on top of the mountain. Let's stand with Peter, James, and John today as they look out from that high place on top of the mountain. I'm telling you, on a clear day, you can see miles. You can see all the places you've been, all the places we've traveled to in our life's experience. But let's also look, as Peter, James, and John did, let's look up into God's cloud of glory. The promise of Transfiguration is that the glory of God transforms the world and us from the most mundane elements and in the most ordinary settings. When we stand at this lookout point in the gospel today, we try to see out from Epiphany into Lent, which is where we'll get ready for our earthly ministry. And we can try to imagine how God will transform us and our world, and how we prepare for our own shared ministry together, and what that will look like next. And from this lookout point today, we can see Ash Wednesday, just days from now. We'll remember God's transforming grace from the most mundane elements with a cross of ashes on our foreheads, and know that this grace is for all of us.